Now it's time for the first negative constructive by Turretin Fan. Turretin Fan, you have 20 minutes. You may begin when you're ready.
The scriptures are, or ought to be, our rule of faith and practice. Thus, Irenaeus called them the invariable rule of truth, the canon tes eleithias eklinas. And Chrysostom referred to them as the exact scale, standard, and rule of all things. Mr. Albrecht alluded earlier in his speech to the fact that we're not going to debate the meaning of the word canon. And that's fine, but one of the meanings, the one that we find here in the early church, is that canon as the rule. In other words, it's not a law or a canon that a council passes, but it is the rule. It is the law. These are the books that govern our lives. That's why the canon is such an important thing. That's why it's important for us to know which books rule our lives and which books are simply edifying and interesting to read. It's amazing in this debate. What's amazing is not the 5 or 6 books over which there's some disagreement, but the enormous amount of agreement among everyone, among so many people who call themselves Christians. They all seem to agree virtually on these 66 books. Now, there's these additional Deuterocanonical or Apocrypha. I may use the terms interchangeably here. There are these additional books, but yet, even within the 66 books, the 27 New Testament books we both agree on, and it's really just in this Old Testament section, and even there, the Pentateuch we agree on, and we agree on the 12 minor prophets. So what are left? There's a few other parts or categories. There's the major prophets, to which Mr. Albrecht's church has accepted also the book of Baruch with the letter of Jeremiah, and as well some apocryphal portions of the book of Daniel. Then in the wisdom literature, there are added Tobit, Judith, and 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Now, there's also a question about whether or not there's 103 verses of Esther that are included, whether or not they should be included. That's also a question. Now, you can see there's sort of 2 different discussions here. There's a discussion about whole books, Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and there's questions about parts of books. Baruch is often included with Jeremiah in some of the ways that it's viewed in the past and the way it's been grouped. Also, things like the letter of Jeremiah is usually included within Baruch. There's these verses in Esther, which are deuterocanonical. There's Susanna, which is included with Daniel, and so forth. So there's books and parts of books. Now, listening to the presentation of Mr. Albrecht, one heard very little positive proof that these are scripture. It was sort of asserted that these have been, generally accepted by the church down through the ages, but we weren't really given any kind of proof that these things are, in fact, scripture, which I suppose is fine, but the listener then has no reason, stopping right here, has no real reason to accept that any of these books as scripture, except for the fact that they seem to have been quoted. I mean, the vast bulk of Mr. Albrecht's discussion, starting immediately after his discussion of the quotation where Jesus talks about the blood from Abel to Zechariah, down through essentially the remaining 10 minutes or so of the discussion, was all lists of references of people who have used these books down through the years. And it's a long list of people who have used the books, but there's not necessarily a link between using the books and us accepting those same books as scripture. The next point I'd like to raise is that we need to focus on 5 ways of evaluating the debate. The first, I would suggest, is the internal evidences. And Mr. Albrecht hasn't really touched on these at all. The internal evidences I shouldn't say he hasn't touched on them at all. He briefly touched on a couple of them, but he hasn't touched on the ones I'm going to bring up. The internal evidences of some of these books. The second is the question of Jewish testimony, and he's mentioned this a little bit, and we'll explain why that's significant as we move on. The third is the biblical testimony. He's mentioned a little bit of this, and we'll address it at greater length. There's the testimony of the early church, which Mr. Albrecht seems to view one way, and I view it quite a different way. And then there's, fifthly, the testimony of the later church. And Mr. Albrecht seems to have passed over that in silence for now. On the internal evidence, if we find mistakes in a book that's allegedly inspired by God, we know that that book is not inspired. If we take a look at, for an example, at the book of Baruch, Baruch 1 claims on its face to be written from Babylon at the time of the burning of Jerusalem to the Jews in Jerusalem to be read in the house of God. Even if we just take that claim as true for the sake of the argument, God would have known that Nebuchadnezzar's army burned the temple, so it wouldn't have been possible for this book to then have been read in the temple. But, perhaps you'll think, well, maybe he just meant for it to be read later on after the temple's rebuilt. Doesn't say that, of course, in Baruch, but let's just say that that was a reasonable out. Well, who's going to be reading this? According to Baruch, it's a person named Joachim, the high priest. But who in the world is that? When we look at the list of all the high priests of Israel, there is a Joachim, but he's post-exilic. He comes after the exile's done. He's not around at the time of the burning of Jerusalem. In fact, he's certainly not the high priest then. We know who the high priest was then, based on the scriptural record. Sariah begat Jehozadak, and then Jehozadak later begat Joshua, who became the high priest immediately on the return. There is a high priest named Joachim that comes after Joshua, but Baruch also specifies who his father is. His father is Kelkias, and there's no Kelkias as the father of Joachim the high priest. Instead, his father is Joshua. So there's an irresolvable problem here in Baruch. And the irresolvable problem is easily resolved by just saying that Baruch is fiction. It's not true. It's not speaking truly. And if we look at the possible explanations for why the Jews wouldn't have accepted this as scripture, one reason is that it's not true scripture. It's fiction. But let's move on. And let's take a second example. The second example is the book of Judith. Judith starts off and makes right off the bat a horrible historical blunder. The horrible historical blunder is asserting that Nebuchadnezzar is king of Assyria and that he's reigning in Nineveh, when in fact Nebuchadnezzar is king of Babylon, reigning there. He's a Persian king. He's not an Assyrian king, and it gets it wrong right off the bat. What's also bad is that Tobit these books don't necessarily have orthodox doctrine in them. Now, there may be some orthodox doctrine, and some of it may be good and useful and edifying, but the book of Tobit, as an example, has syncretic paganism. The angel in this story in Tobit instructs someone as a way of driving out demons, not the way that Christ and the apostles drove out demons, but instead it suggests this, Tobit 6:16, and when thou shalt come into the marriage chamber, thou shalt take the ashes of perfume, and shall lay upon them some of the heart and liver of the fish, and shall make a smoke of it, and the devil shall smell it and flee away, and never come again any more. And then this is blended in with worship of God into a syncretic mixture. It's not orthodox belief, and there's nothing particularly Christian about Tobit's discussion here, which gets us somewhat into what Mr. Albrecht had been asserting, that somehow these books were rejected because they're too Christian. We'll address that a little later on. Let's turn specifically to the question of what do the Jews say. The question of what the Jews say is important because they did have the oracles of God. As Mr. Albrecht pointed out, he points out that it's past tense. That's fine, but they had them. They were given those oracles of God. Their testimony is significant, and their testimony is against the Deuterocanonicals. Josephus provides a list of the scriptures. His list is not normally thought of as being polemic, anti-Christian, but his list does not include any deuterocanonical works. The same thing goes for those Jews who preserved the scriptures, through whose hands we have the original Hebrew today. Those Jews did not treat the deuterocanonicals as scripture. Now, someone can try to allege that that's just a different sect or different version, but that is the evidence that we have. And when we go back into those church fathers, even the ones that Mr. Albrecht mentioned, when they're talking to the Jews, as Mr. Albrecht acknowledged when he was talking about Justin Martyr, he said Justin Martyr didn't use those books because he's dealing with Jews and the Jews didn't accept them. Well, that proves my point. It's not something new. It's not something that happened only in the 9th century with the Masoretes. It's not something that was all the way back in the earliest period of the history of the Jews. They have not accepted these. They've never accepted these as being inspired scripture. They may have accepted them for other purposes, and in fact, we may have some reason to believe that they accepted them for some purpose, but not for the purposes of being considered Holy Scripture. They're not the rule of faith in life.